Hi friends, welcome back to Learning Space. So this is the IAS Prelims 2019 mock test series explanation video, and we are going to discuss about the questions which are related to geography, Indian polity and art and culture. So first of all, before beginning this lecture, I need to stress upon something. Whichever question needs a lot of explanation, I am going to put it in the first series, and whichever needs some sort of less explanation, we are pushing it towards the end of the video. So starting with the questions pertaining to geography. Consider the following statements about Coriolis force. So what is Coriolis force basically? It is a deflecting force. So this is going to affect the deflection or the direction of the wind. So Coriolis force does not affect the speed of the wind, rather it is going to have its effect over the direction of the wind. So that is why the second statement is wrong here, and you have the answer as 1 and 3. Now if you take a look about the third statement, the magnitude of the Coriolis force is actually directly proportional to the speed of the moving body. So this is a general character when you take the Coriolis force. So let us take about the explanation. Coriolis force is rather not a force. What is it actually? It is an effect, a deflecting effect which is caused because of the rotation of the earth. So when you take this Coriolis force, it is going to affect the wind direction and definitely not the wind speed. It is going to act on any moving body, and what is to be noted is the magnitude of the deflection. It is going to be directly proportional to the sine of the latitude. This is sine of the latitude. That is directly going to be proportional to the mass of the moving body and to the horizontal velocity of the wind. So put it simply, it is going to be directly proportional to the speed of a moving body. So let us move on to the second question that we have. Now here the question asks about the origin and the mechanism of the Indian monsoon. So what is to be noted is that when you take the third point, here you have the differential heating and the cooling. So this can be said to be the very basic reason for the creation of Indian monsoons. Because of the creation of heating with regard to the Tibetan landmass, you are going to have the winds getting pushed towards the Indian landmass. So this Tibetan landmass, you have an intense low pressure that is getting developed, because of which the southwest monsoon winds enter very easily towards India. So this is definitely right. Take a look at about the first and the second statement. So the circulation of upper air jet streams, in fact, jet streams prove to be an important part with regard to the evolution of Indian monsoons. For example, we have already dealt about your tropical easterly jet stream. We also read about your subtropical westerly jet stream. So even jet streams are going to play a part, and the very first statement says the position of the Himalayas and the Tibetan plateau. Now this Tibetan plateau can act both as a mechanical barrier as well as a high level heat source. The same goes with the case of the Himalayan belt as well. So what happens here is, take a look at this picture that we have. The Himalayas, what do? They act as a mechanical barrier, and they will deflect all of the southwesterly monsoon winds towards the Indian subcontinent. It does not let it pass behind the Himalayas. So this is how the country of India receives the maximum rainfall because of the southwest monsoons, thanks to the Himalayas. So this is the factors related to air pressure and winds, and we have a set of factors which is related to location and relief. So the source is actually module 1 and 2 of Indian climate. So wherever it is possible, we have given the source. So please take a look at the source as well. And here if you take a look at the factors related to location and relief, we have Himalayan mountains, we have the distribution of land and water, which is nothing but the heating and the cooling of the land and the water systems. And similarly, when you take the upper air circulation, that is nothing but the role of jet streams. So let us move on to the third question. So here we are talking about the O horizon in the soil profile. As the name suggests, this is rightly called as a O horizon because it is going to comprise predominantly of organic material. So it is largely going to comprise of organic material. Statement 1 is wrong just because this statement is completely wrong. With very little organic material, that cannot be truly said, because organic horizon or the O horizon literally is dominated by this particular organic matter, and your A horizon, that is going to comprise predominantly of minerals, and it is generally absent in the forested areas. Again, this is wrong. and that is because when you take the forest areas, the O horizon, so that will comprise of some partially decomposed or undecomposed state of leaves and litter. So the second statement is also wrong here. So if you see this particular diagram, you can very well see that the O horizon is going to comprise of some sort of organic litter or organic material, and the source is nothing but module 3 of Indian soils. And the next question talks about the source of rivers in certain ranges. So we are talking about Aravalli ranges. Here, except for the Mahi river, everything else actually rises from the Aravallis. So Mahi river rises in the western Vindhyan ranges, and this is a map which suggests about this particular rise of the rivers of Luni, Sabarmati and Banas in the Aravalli ranges. So this is an improvisation of one of a module of Indian range. And then moving on to the next question, we are talking about a term which is called as Fenny. What is this Fenny all about? So this is quite tricky here, because the Fenny is also a river, a Fenny is also a drink. So both the statements, if you look at it, it is the name of the river which is actually flowing in Tripura. So the statement is actually correct. And why is it in news? Yes, recently there has been a development wherein they are going to construct, there is a proposal to construct a bridge over the river Fenny, and this is essentially going to link your northeastern states with that of Bangladesh. So this is going to promote trade activities in northeastern parts of India. And if you take the second statement here, this is talking about a drink in Goa, that is completely correct. But this liquor of Goa, the Fenny, which is a liquor of Goa, that is actually tapped from cashew crop and not palm tree. So that is the mistake in the second statement. Now if you are moving to the next question, we have the Gulf of certain places in South Asia, and the question asks you to arrange it from north to south. So it's a very simple question, provided you know where is Gulf of Martaban. The rest three names are quite similar, because you might have heard about Kambat, you might have heard about Mannar and Kutch, but Gulf of Martaban, some may not know about that particular Gulf. So the positioning we have listed out in this particular map, starting from Gulf of Kutch, you have Gulf of Kambat, you have Gulf of Martaban, and finally you have the Gulf of Mannar. Such map based questions are quite important when it comes to UPSC. And again another question, now this is about oceanography. So they are asking which one of the below has got the largest continental shelf. So the answer is actually Siberian Shelf in Arctic Ocean. Now this is actually sourced from module 1 of oceanography, and here we have talked about how the width of the continental shelf varies from ocean to ocean, and particularly this point talks about the Siberian Shelf in Arctic Ocean, which has got the largest continental shelf. And moving on to the next question, again a question pertaining to oceanography. The question, please understand it, they are talking about the spatial variation in sea water salinity, and that is somehow related to the origin of the oceanic currents. So if you know the link between salinity and the oceanic currents, you can very well answer this question. So here you have salinity being the actual reason for the origin of oceanic currents. So this statement is correct, and with the other factors being constant, this salinity and density are directly proportional to one another. So they are positively correlated, which means they are directly proportional. And what happens is, how do you say this salinity and density eventually leading on to oceanic currents? What is the link there? So that is critical to analyze. What happens is, when the salinity of an oceanic mass, if it increases, then obviously its density will also increase. Now what happens, because of the rise of density, because of increased salinity, the denser water will sink or will subside to the lower parts of the ocean, and it will flow as a subsurface current. The denser water, the more saline water will flow as subsurface current, whereas the less saline water moves towards the greater saline water as surface current. Because of the less salinity, obviously it is going to have less density, which means it will flow as a surface current. Now what is to be noted here is, what is this relationship between less saline water moving towards greater saline water? So this is quite obvious. In less saline water, you are going to have less of solute, which means less of salt, and more of water will be there. Whereas in greater saline water, you are going to have greater components of solute and less component of water. Now, water has a tendency to flow from higher water areas towards the lower water areas. That is why from the less saline areas, water is going to flow towards the greater saline areas. So that is why there is going to be a oceanic movement in the form of oceanic current, which is getting formed because of the differences in salinity. So this is how the statement 1 is actually correct, and salinity and density are actually positively correlated. So here in fact both the statements are correct. And now moving on to another question of oceanography. Evaporation is controlled, evaporation controls. So this statement may look tricky at the first look, but if you analyze it, it is actually quite simple. Evaporation controls the salinity of water. Yes, that is true. Greater is your evaporation, greater will be the salinity of the seawater, because when the water gets evaporated, what is left behind? All you have is mere salt. So that is how greater the evaporation, greater will be the salinity of the seawater. And now take a look at the very first statement. Evaporation is controlled by the salinity. Greater the solute, which means greater the salts in water, lower will be the rate of evaporation, because when you have too much amount of salt, when you have too much amount of solute, your solvent will be comparatively lesser. So because of which, when water is lesser, obviously evaporation is going to be less. Therefore, the statement is correct. Solute, if it is going to be higher, that actually lowers the rate of evaporation, and vice versa. So that is why the statement says that evaporation is actually controlled by the salinity and evaporation controls the salinity. Both the statements are perfectly right. Now, source is actually an improvisation of module 3 of oceanography, wherein we discussed about the issue of salinity. And here we are talking about some methods of irrigation. So we are talking about two methods. One is going to be canal irrigation and the other is going to be tank irrigation. So tank irrigation is popular in the Peninsular Plateau, whereas if you take the canal irrigation, it is going to be predominantly present in the northern plains of India. So what happens in northern plain? Here you have some extensive command area. Also you are going to have low relief feature. So that is the wrong statement with regard to the first part. How can you build a canal irrigation when your relief feature is going to be undulating in nature? In fact, canal irrigation is possible only when you have a very leveled land. So that is why northern plains actually favor canal irrigation. A quick explanation with regard to tank irrigation. So this tank irrigation is basically popular in the peninsular region. It is built by having a water storage which have been developed by constructing a small bund of earth, that is all around the tank you have a bund which is raised by earth or by stones built across a stream or a river. Now, Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu are the leading states when it comes to the tank irrigation. The undulating relief, the hard rock structure when it comes to the peninsular region makes it difficult to dig canals. Also, there is a very little percolation of rainwater due to the hard rock structure of the peninsular region, because of which most of this region will suffer drought-like conditions when this summer season comes up. Most of the rivers of this region are very much seasonal and they dry up during the summer season. All of it make the tank irrigation to be very much favorable when it comes to the peninsular region. And then we have canal irrigation. So this is actually present in areas of low level relief. Please understand that. Deep fertile soils, perennial source of water, wherein water actually flows through the canal perennially, and you have extensive command area. All these are essential features of the northern plains of India. And the digging of canals in rocky and uneven surfaces becomes extremely difficult, and it is possible in the areas of Punjab, Haryana and UP. Now, however, the coastal and the deltaic regions in the southern parts of India, they do have some amount of canals in them. So this, please understand, it is basically in coastal areas and in the deltaic coast or deltaic regions of the southern parts of India. Moving on to the next question. So here we are discussing about tropical cyclones. So large sea surface with temperature higher than 27 degrees Celsius is actually favorable for the formation of tropical cyclone. A very basic statement. And now if you take a look at the second statement, another favorable condition is actually they mentioned upper air convergence. How can you have upper air convergence and thereby a cyclone getting formed? Because when you are going to have some upper air convergence, and in the case of a cyclone, you need to have a low pressure in the center. So when you are going to have an upper air convergence, consequently, it will lead to the formation of a high pressure zone and definitely not a low pressure. So what you need in the case of a tropical cyclone? You need upper air divergence. Air has to flow outward. So this is the basic thing about the formation of the cyclone. So conditions which are very favorable, we have mentioned in module number 24 of climatology, and here large sea surface temperature with temperatures exceeding 27 degrees Celsius. Presence of Coriolis force, because this rotation needs a Coriolis force to take place. Minimum variation in the vertical wind speed, which means wind shearing should be absent. Pre-existing weak low pressure area. Please understand, a cyclone is actually going to develop over a low pressure zone. So when there is already a pre-existing low pressure zone, then that is actually very much favorable for the development of an cyclone. For the intensification of a storm, for the intensification of a low pressure belt into a cyclone eventually will take place when you already have a pre-existing weak low pressure area. And upper air divergence, I have just now mentioned how an upper air divergence is quite necessary for the formation of a cyclone. So now we are moving on to the questions pertaining to art and culture. Take a look at the first question. Here we are mentioning some random terms. Terms like Rupabheda, Bhava, Pramanam and Lavanya Yochanam. So all these are actually related to the Shatangas of Indian painting. So we have mentioned about these 6 limbs of Indian painting with regard to module number 1 of the painting module. And the next statement here, the Edwin Lutyens, we are talking about Edwin Lutyens and Chandigarh. So how can Lutyens be related to Chandigarh? Lutyens is someone who has designed Delhi. So Chandigarh is very much connected to Le Corbusier. So again, the first statement is wrong for that matter. And Laurie Baker has definitely contributed towards low cost housing projects. But Aranya low cost housing is not connected to Laurie Baker. So if you have followed the module number 24 of Indian architecture, you might have been able to answer this particular question. So Laurie Baker is definitely connected to mass housing concept, but this particular Aranya low cost housing has been designed by Balakrishna Doshi, and Le Corbusier designed Chandigarh Capital Complex. And now moving on to the cultural event of Kambala. So Kambala is a bull taming sport. No, actually it is not a bull taming sport. In fact, Jallikattu is a bull taming sport, whereas Kambala is actually a buffalo race. So this is actually held between November and March in and around the regions of Karnataka. So the belief is that when you take place this kind of Kambala event, it will actually appease the gods and will lead to a good harvest for the people of Karnataka. So this is an annual buffalo race which is held in the regions of Karnataka. The area is called as Tulunadu. This is an annual event which starts in the month of November and lasts till March every year. And this particular festival, it is believed that if you celebrate it, it is basically to please the gods and thereby to get good harvest. And finally, one important point is that it is dedicated to Kadri's Lord Manjunatha, who is actually an incarnation of Lord Shiva. So this is going to be a part of the current affairs, and this particular issue will be also taking up in the next art and culture current affairs revision modules. And now moving on to Calicut painting. So Calicut painting, it originated in Bengal, no doubt about it. It is having a very deep influence, or you can say it got very deeply influenced by the Patua art. So the scroll painting of Bengal is otherwise known as Patua art, and that actually deeply influenced the Calicut painting. And the point here is, Shankaradeva is not depicted in the case of Calicut painting. It was actually Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So this is sourced from module 8 of Indian painting, and when you take the Calicut painting, it actually originated in the vicinity of Kali temple in Kolkata. So the traditional art of scroll paintings that had a very good effect upon the Calicut painting. So what happened was, traditionally there was some painters who actually drew the Patua art in the case of villages. But what happened with the arrival of the British, you had this particular greater interest that is getting developed with regard to the Indian art, and especially the artist from the village. They got settled in Kolkata city and they developed a new painting which came to be known as the Calicut painting, and images of goddess Kali got further importance with regard to Calicut painting, and you have Chaitanya Mahaprabhu getting depicted as well. And Jaimini Roy is said to be one of the greatest exponent when it comes to the Calicut painting. And now moving on to Saint Kabir. Please understand, I need to mention a point here. Saint Kabir can be a very probable question in this year's prelims or in mains. That is because 2018 is said to be the 500th death anniversary of Saint Kabir, which means it can be a very probable question. The government themselves have commemorated the event, which means it can be a very probable question for prelims or mains. Now, Kabir openly ridiculed all forms of external worship. He in fact ridiculed some of the concepts which is behind Hinduism and Islam and the preeminence of priestly class. He was completely against the priestly class. He vouched strongly for Nirguna Bhakti and not Saguna Bhakti. Nirguna means formless form of worship. And he got all his spiritual training from his basic teacher, who was Guru Ramananda. So Kabir is the first Indian saint who has coordinated both the teachings of Hinduism as well as Islam. He actually gave in for this universal path which could be followed by both the Hindus and the Muslims. So you have the path of the Kabir, who are otherwise known as, the followers are known as Kabir Pantis. Now, he ridiculed all forms of external worship. He even rejected some major religious tradition, and he vouched for Nirguna form of bhakti. Nirguna meaning formless worship of God. Saguna meaning wherein the God has got a proper form and attribute to the particular God. Like for example, we worship Lord Vishnu in a certain form. Lord Krishna is actually in a certain form. So these are the physical attributes of the God. So that is actually referred to as Saguna Bhakti, and Kabir Panth or Kabir Panthis is actually the followers who follow the teachings of Saint Kabir. So again, the module 11 of Religion and Philosophy talks in detail about Saint Kabir. So take a look at the next question that we have. This question discusses about the SaveAbed Scheme. So the SaveAbed Scheme is a scheme that has been recently brought about by the Ministry of Culture. Now this scheme, however, is not a centrally sponsored scheme. It is actually a central sector scheme. And also the second half of the question is again wrong. It is not just for Hindu charitable religious institutions. It is for charitable religious institutions of all the religions. So that is why only the first statement is correct. So Ministry of Culture launched this central sector scheme to reduce the financial burdens of all the charitable institutions, be it a church, be it a mosque or anything. Now, what does the scheme aims to? The scheme envisages reimbursing the CGST component and the IGST component of such charitable religious institutions who provide food or prasad without any discrimination. Now what happens is, they thought, let us reimburse the CGST and the IGST component back to those institutions. So this is to reduce the financial burdens of those religious institutions. So this was sourced from PIB article. So this actually gives a set of norms by which certain religious institutions can be chosen by the government. Like, it should have been in existence for the preceding 5 years. It should have been distributing free food, langar, for the past 3 years on the date of application. It also says that it should serve free food for at least 5,000 people in a month, and it should not be blacklisted under any provisions of the central government or by the state government. So these are some of the norms by which you have to select that particular religious institution. And now we are moving on to the questions pertaining to polity. So the very first question discusses about Article 370, which is actually the temporary provisions pertaining to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. So the question that was asked here is, provisions which are given in the Indian Constitution under Article 370. Now, though all of the statements may look correct, what happens is the second and the third statement do not fall under Article 370 as mentioned in the Indian Constitution. These were actually added later on by a presidential order pursuing the provisions of Article 370. There is a big difference between what is the provision that is given under Article 370 and what are the recent modification, or you can say what are the later modification that has been done pursuing Article 370. So, this was made through a presidential order, whereas statement 1 and statement 4 are as per your Article 370. So, this is the difference. So, the correct statement is 1 and 4. Article 370 discusses about the temporary provision, and 1 and 4 alone corresponds to the provisions which is given in Article 370, whereas the rest has been brought about by a constitution order of 1954 by the president during that particular time. And then moving on to the private committee, that is the Committee on Private Members' Bills and Resolutions. So, here interestingly, this committee is actually a part of only your Lok Sabha. Rajya Sabha has got this particular provision, that is the Committee on Private Members and Bills is not present with the case of Rajya Sabha. The same has been undertaken by the Business Advisory Committee of Rajya Sabha. So, the correct answer should be 1 and 3. Let us discuss about this particular question in an even more closer look. Here the committee is a special committee of the Lok Sabha, and it consists of about 15 members including the Deputy Speaker as its chairman. The Rajya Sabha does not have such a committee. Rather, what happens, the same function in the case of Rajya Sabha is performed by the Business Advisory Committee of that particular house. And when you talk about the private members' bills, it has been in the news quite a lot of time in the year of 2018 and also in the year of 2019. Which means there can be some question with regard to this committee with regard to private members' bill. The last time a private members' bill was passed was in the year of 1970, and this was the Supreme Court Bill of 1968. The source has been Lakshmikant mostly. And then we are moving on to one interesting thing, which is electronically transmitted postal ballot system. So, this was again recently in the news with regard to Chenganur Assembly by-poll election. Now, what is this ETPBS? Now, this provides an alternate method of quick dispatch of postal ballot paper, but what is to be noted is that this was not introduced for the very first time in this by-poll election. Rather, it was already introduced in Puducherry's by-poll election. And the wrong part with regard to the third statement is that end-to-end encrypted messages, that is not present. Rather, you have QR code and OTP and PIN system to ensure the security features. Also, two-way electronic transmission is not present. What happens in the case of this kind of electronically transmitted postal ballot system is that the user or the voter, they have to first of all download that particular electronic postal ballot paper, they have to fill their vote, and later on they have to send it through post to the returning officer. So, this is actually having a one-way electronic transmission, whereas the other way it is actually sent through post. It is not a two-way electronic transmission system. Please remember that. And next, moving on, this is going to be jointly developed by the Election Commission along with the help of CDAC. CDAC is nothing but Center for Development of Advanced Computing, and as I mentioned to you, it uses QR codes for maintaining the uniqueness and the secrecy of the entire transmission along with the usage of OTP and PIN. And this was first used in the case of Lillithopu elections in Puducherry. And now coming on to the question pertaining to EVM. So, the thing is that EVM is a standalone mission, there is no external communication. Now, with regard to the first statement, had the question been that this particular EVM mission is completely non-programmable, then it would have been wrong. But since it is given that it is non-reprogrammable, this particular statement is correct. So, the first two statements are correct, but the ones who have actually developed the source code and the software for EVM, that is this particular ECIL, Electronics Corporation of India Limited, along with the Bharat Electronics Limited, and not CDAC. So, the statement 3 is absolutely not correct. And now moving on to the next important question. Here we are talking about the members of the Finance Commission. Now if you have read Lakshmikant, you would have known that all these statements, statement 1, 2 and 4 have been picked up verbatim from Lakshmikant. But what is with regard to statement 3 is that there in that particular book we have a line that a judge of a high court can become a member of the Finance Commission. But there is also one critical line. It is mentioned that or one who is qualified to be appointed as a judge, meaning even an advocate who has got an experience of about 10 years in a high court can be eligible to become a member of the Finance Commission. So that is the criticality with regard to this particular question. And now we are moving on to one another committee with regard to the Parliament, which is the Ethics Committee. So as the name suggests, it is obviously going to discuss about cases of misconduct and recommends appropriate action. And there are a separate ethics committee for both the houses of Parliament. The Lok Sabha has got one separate committee, the Rajya Sabha has got one more separate committee. So both the statements are correct here. And now why was it in news? That is again important because recently this particular ethics committee was in news because L.K. Advani, Lal Krishna Advani, has been re-nominated as the chairman of the ethics committee in the case of the Lok Sabha. So what is this ethics committee? It was first of all constituted in Rajya Sabha and later on it got constituted in Lok Sabha, and it enforces code of conduct on the MPs and it therefore maintains discipline and decorum in the Parliament. The chairperson of the committee will be nominated by the presiding officer of that particular house. And then moving on to the Nota with regard to EVMs. So the Nota button, it got introduced through one landmark judgment, which is the People's Union for Civil Liberties versus Union of India. Now with regard to the Nota securing the highest votes, there is no provision that a fresh election must be called for in the case of a Lok Sabha election. Such a power has not been given with regard to the Election Commission of India. So even if Nota secures the highest vote, the person who has secured the majority number of votes apart from the Nota will be obviously elected in that particular constituency. And recently the ECI, the Election Commission of India, has brought about this particular judgment that the Nota, that is your Nota, will be applicable only for direct elections like assembly elections but not for Rajya Sabha election. So this is actually following one of the judgment which was given out by Supreme Court. Now Nota was introduced in the year of 2013. It is a ballot option by which the general people, they can say that we do not approve of any candidate who is in the fray. So this is something of a negative vote, but what you need to understand is negative voting is not very much proper with regard to Indian scenario because we do not have the power of right to recall the candidate. Only then the negative vote will be complete in nature. So right now this Nota is just to express your disapproval with regard to the candidature list. However, Election Commission currently has got no plenary power to call for a fresh election even if Nota secures the highest vote. The candidate with the maximum votes after the Nota will win the election irrespective of the number of votes which Nota got. So to give a greater sanctity to Nota and to order a fresh election, Rule 64 of the Conduct of Election Rules will have to be amended. So what is this Rule 64? It refers to the declaration of the result of election, but this rule as of now, it does not describe a situation wherein Nota gets the highest vote than the candidate. This has not been mentioned with regard to Rule 64. And now moving on to Article 35A. Now both Article 35A and Article 370 with regard to the Indian Constitution is quite important because this is the year wherein we are actually commemorating 70 years of accession of Jammu and Kashmir towards the Indian country. So again you can expect some of the questions with regard to 35A and 370. So 35A is obviously introduced under Article 370 through a presidential order, but the second statement here, Part 3 of the fundamental right, it is applicable to the state but with certain exception and with certain modification. whereas part 4 is definitely not applicable to the state, and that is why the second statement is completely wrong. And now moving on to some of the easier question. The terms of Zabo, Bavdi and Kool, that actually refers to the traditional systems of water management. You might have known about these particular systems of water management, and if you have seen the module 5 of the Indian climate, this question has been picked verbatim from the module 5, and all of these are actually local storms of the hot weather season. Especially take a look at nor'westers. Here this nor'wester attacks the regions of Bengal and Assam, and here you have the names like Bardoli Chira, Kal Baisakhi, referring to nothing but nor'westers. So all of the options are correct. And which of the following currents flow in the southern hemisphere? Except for west wind drift and Agulhas current, the Canary current, it actually flows in the northern hemisphere. So that is why the first two statements are actually correct. And now Fields Medal refers to an achievement in mathematics sector, a very simple question which has been in the current affairs. And now moving on to Ambumbachi Mela. Ambumbachi Mela is actually a Mela which actually celebrates the menstruation of women. So here it actually takes place at the Kamakya temple, which is in Guwahati. So that is how the first statement is wrong. This fair actually celebrates the annual menstruation of goddess Kamakya. So this is very important. In fact, we will be discussing about this particular Mela in the next current affairs revision modules pertaining to culture. And moving on to the last question, here we are talking about service voters. So who are the service voter? All of them who are actually having some sort of service qualification with regard to the government of India will come under the service voter, which includes all of these four category only. So you have the members of the armed forces, some reserve forces of India, and then you have some armed police forces of a state who are serving outside that particular state, and finally who are employed by the government of India in a post which is outside India. So all of the above are correct, and these particular people are referred to as service voters. And that concludes the module for the day. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.